Okay, so you want to own a medieval sheep estate. You picture rolling green hills covered with thousands of sheep, a stone farmhouse in the valley, shepherds walking between the flocks, and carts filled with wool after shearing season. There are no giant machines, no factory chimneys, no expensive castle walls. The grass grows, the sheep eat it, and once every year you remove the wool and sell it. It sounds like medieval passive income. And for a while, English wool really could create extraordinary wealth. In the 13th century, wool was England's most important export and one of the great sources of national wealth. Merchants carried English fleeces toward the textile centers of Flanders and beyond. Monasteries accumulated large flocks. Merchants became rich enough to buy estates and lend money to kings. At Buildwas Abbey, record from 1291 suggests that roughly 60% of income from important estates came from livestock, compared with about 20% from arable farming. So the fantasy is not ridiculous. Grass really could become money. But then look at another medieval wool producer. Rievaulx Abbey entered contracts requiring around 50 sacks of wool per year, an amount researchers estimate would require roughly 11,600 sheep. After disease damaged its flocks, the abbey still had contracts to fulfill and had borrowed at least 1,992 pounds from Italian wool merchants. The sheep could die. The contract did not. That is the medieval sheep estate contradiction. Wool is harvested once a year. The flock consumes resources every day, and tomorrow's fleece may already belong to somebody who paid you yesterday. So the question is not whether medieval sheep could make an owner rich. They clearly could. The question is whether the estate could keep enough healthy animals on enough productive land, survive disease and bad weather, and deliver the wool it had already promised. By the end of this, you will understand where the money came from, why pasture mattered more than sheep count, how medieval wool became an international financial product, and how a field full of animals could hide a deeply indebted business. The first thing to understand is that a medieval sheep estate was not simply a field with sheep inside it. A large operation required different kinds of land. Summer pasture allowed animals to graze during the growing season. Meadow produced hay for winter. Arable fields could provide additional fodder. Woodland, commons, upland grazing, and rights over neighboring land might extend the usable feeding area. That distinction matters. A sheep that can feed itself cheaply on open pasture is an attractive asset. A sheep that must be supported through a long winter with scarce hay is an expense. This made meadow surprisingly valuable. Medieval livestock farming depended on hay to keep animals alive when fresh grass stopped growing. A large flock without enough winter feed was not wealth. It was a countdown. Then there was the structure of the flock itself. Not every animal performed the same job. Breeding ewes produced lambs. Rams supplied genetics. Young animals became future breeding or wool stock. Older animals could eventually be sold or slaughtered. Wethers, castrated males, were particularly useful in wool-focused systems because they could be kept for repeated fleece production without the reproductive management required by breeding animals. Archaeological evidence from medieval England shows increasing emphasis on adult sheep and males as wool production intensified. So the strong estate did not simply count animals. It managed age, sex, reproduction, wool quality, and replacement. A flock of 5,000 poorly managed sheep could be less valuable than a smaller flock producing better wool with lower mortality. Before you earn anything, you need to acquire that flock. Sheep themselves require capital. Then you need shepherds. Large estates might divide animals across different granges or pasture units, each requiring supervision. Shepherds watch for predators, injury, wandering animals, difficult births, parasites, and disease. They move flocks between grazing areas. They help separate breeding groups. They monitor lambs. Dogs, huts, folds, fences, gates, and equipment support the process. The estate looks peaceful because somebody is constantly managing it. Then comes winter. This is where the attractive summer landscape becomes an agricultural balance sheet. Hay must be cut when grass is abundant. It must be dried properly. It must be stored without rotting. Enough must survive until spring. A poor hay harvest creates two problems at once. there is less fodder, and the price of buying replacement fodder from someone else rises because neighboring estates may be suffering from the same shortage. The owner can sell animals to reduce the flock. But if everyone is selling during a crisis, livestock prices can fall. You're selling the asset exactly when everyone else wants to sell theirs. Now we reach the product that made the entire system famous: wool. Shearing usually created one major annual harvest. Teams had to gather the sheep, remove the fleece, sort the wool, pack it, store it, and prepare for sale. Quality mattered enormously. Not every part of the fleece had equal value. Not every region produced equally desirable wool. Feeding, breeding, age, health, contamination, and local sheep characteristics all influenced what a merchant was willing to pay. This means the estate was not simply producing pounds of fiber. It was producing a graded commodity. The difference between excellent and mediocre wool could change the value of the same number of sheep. Now consider how little wool each animal actually contributed. Research using medieval manorial accounts suggests that adult sheep on the Winchester bishopric estates produced around 1.5 pounds of fleece per animal in one reference period. A medieval export sack contained roughly 364 pounds of wool. So one sack represented the annual production of hundreds of animals. A warehouse holding 20 sacks looked like a compact pile of merchandise. Outside the warehouse stood thousands of mouths that had spent an entire year creating it. That is the first financial trap. The valuable product is small. The biological factory producing it is enormous. Once packed, the wool entered a trading network much larger than the estate. Local merchants aggregated fleeces. Major merchants maintained connections in London and overseas. English wool traveled to textile-producing regions, including the Low Countries, where skilled workers transformed it into cloth. A successful estate, therefore, needed more than good sheep. It needed access to buyers. A remote flock with poor roads and weak merchant relationships could receive worse terms than an estate connected to established wool markets. Transport mattered. Wool had to move from pasture to storage, then toward market towns, rivers, roads, or ports. Carts required horses or oxen. Animals required feed. Drivers required wages or provisions. Bad roads slowed movement. Rain could damage poorly protected wool. The product was valuable enough to justify movement across Europe, but somebody had to pay for every stage. Then the crown appeared. From 1275, the English crown imposed a national customs duty of 6 shillings and 8 pence on each sack of exported wool. Additional subsidies could be imposed later, especially when kings needed money for war. Even when the estate did not personally export the wool, taxation influenced what merchants could afford to offer producers. The wool might grow on your land. The government still understood how to take a share of the trade. Now look at the first major revenue stream, the annual wool clip. This is the obvious one. Thousands of sheep create thousands of fleeces. The wool is sorted and sold either to domestic middlemen or merchants connected to international buyers. If quality is high and European textile demand is strong, a large estate can receive a major cash payment from one harvest. But it is concentrated revenue. You spend much of the year maintaining the biological machine. Then a large part of the cash arrives around one seasonal event. The second revenue stream is livestock sales. The estate does not keep every lamb forever. Some young animals can be sold. Older animals can be culled. Surplus breeding stock can move to other farms. Animals that are no longer optimal wool producers may still have meat value. This provides cash at different points in the year and allows the manager to adjust flock size. But selling too many animals damages future production. A ewe sold today does not produce next year's lamb. A healthy wether sold today does not grow next year's fleece. Livestock sales therefore improve cash flow by reducing future productive capacity. The third revenue stream comes from skins and other animal products. When sheep die or are slaughtered, the skin still carries value. Medieval customs records treated wool fells as an important traded commodity alongside wool itself. Depending on the estate and local practices, milk and cheese could also matter. but these were secondary layers. The strongest wool operation did not confuse byproducts with the core engine. The fourth source of value is manure. This is easy to underestimate because it may never appear as a bag of coins. Sheep convert grass into fertilizer. Flocks could be folded on arable land, concentrating manure onto fields that would later grow crops. That creates value elsewhere in the estate. The sheep business can therefore improve the grain business. An animal producing wool may simultaneously reduce the need to replace soil fertility in another part of the farming system. The fifth layer is land utilization. Some ground is much better suited to grazing than to intensive grain production. Upland pasture and open wolds can support sheep, where alternative agricultural uses produce less value. This is one reason wool transformed landscapes, such as the Cotswolds. The estate is effectively converting land with limited alternatives into a tradable export commodity. The sixth layer is finance. This is where medieval wool becomes surprisingly modern. A monastery did not always wait until shearing day to receive cash. It could sell future wool in advance. Merchants provided money now. The monastery promised wool later. A surviving Pipewell Abbey agreement from 1242 sold the abbey's next entire marketable wool crop before that wool had been produced. Good wool was priced differently from medium wool. Payments were scheduled in advance of final delivery. Economically, the sheep had started producing cash before the fleece existed. This solved a real problem. Estates needed money throughout the year. Buildings required repair. Food had to be purchased. Debts had to be paid. A merchant advance converted future production into current liquidity, but created a new risk. You no longer simply hoped next year's flock would produce wool. You had promised that wool to someone else. If production fell, the missing wool became a financial problem. Now build a simplified late 13th century sheep estate. This is an illustrative model, not a historical average. Assume the estate maintains roughly 6,000 adult sheep and replacement animals across several pasture units. Using historical wool yield evidence as a rough guide, the flock might produce around 25 to 26 export sacks of wool in a normal year. Assume the average realized wool value across different grades works out to about 6 pounds per sack. The annual clip produces roughly 155 pounds. Sales of lambs, surplus animals, and older sheep contribute another 85 pounds. Skins, dairy production, and other livestock products contribute 25 pounds. The value of grazing arrangements and other pastoral receipts adds another 25 pounds. Manure and integration with a wider agricultural estate create an estimated internal value of 35 pounds. Total economic value reaches approximately 325 pounds. Now support the flock. Shepherds, assistants, provisions, and supervision consume 45 pounds. Hay, winter fodder, pasture management, and seasonal feeding require 50 pounds. Breeding stock, replacement animals, and routine flock losses cost 35 pounds. Shearing, sorting, packing, wool storage, and seasonal labor consume 20 pounds. Carts, horses, transport, merchant expenses, and market access require 20 pounds. Folds, fences, barns, granges, dogs, tools, and routine repairs consume 30 pounds. Estate administration, rents, religious obligations, and other charges require 30 pounds. A prudent reserve for disease, severe weather, and animal replacement consumes another 35 pounds. Financing and outstanding obligations take 25 pounds. Total annual cost reaches roughly 290 pounds. The estate keeps about 35 pounds of economic surplus. Thousands of sheep cover the hills. Hundreds of pounds move through the operation. The free margin is small. That is the second financial trap. A large flock is not necessarily a large profit. Now change one variable. European wool prices fall by 25%. The annual wool clip loses nearly 40 pounds of value. The sheep still eat. The shepherd still works. The hay has already been cut. The estate moves from a modest surplus into a small deficit. Nothing visibly changed in the fields. The market several hundred miles away changed the owner's financial result. Now change a second variable. Disease kills or weakens 20% of the flock. You lose fleece immediately. You lose lamb production. You lose future breeding capacity. Some dead animals may still produce usable skins, but that does not replace the living production machine. To rebuild the flock, the estate must retain more lambs or buy replacement animals. Revenue falls at the same time replacement cost rises. And if next year's was already been sold under an advance contract, the crisis becomes much worse. You may need to purchase wool from somebody else to fulfill the agreement, or negotiate with the merchant, or borrow more money. A biological problem has now become a credit problem. This is exactly why wool finance could become dangerous. Revo Abbey's flocks were badly affected by disease. Researchers found that later wool commitments could exceed what its recovering flock could realistically produce. The abbey had also borrowed heavily from Italian wool merchants. The grass was still there. The monastery was still there. The contracts had simply grown larger than the productive flock beneath them. Now look at Pipewell Abbey. Pipewell was a Cistercian monastery in Northamptonshire with deep involvement in the wool trade. Like other religious houses, it used advance wool contract to obtain cash from foreign merchants. At first the logic was attractive. Sell future wool. Receive money now. Use that money to operate the institution. Then difficult years arrived. Animal disease damaged productivity. Periods of dearth increased pressure. Existing debts still required payment. Instead of solving the underlying problem, additional agreements and new borrowing could be used to service earlier obligations. Future wool was committed to support yesterday's finances. Eventually, the process became unsustainable. Contemporary evidence describes a monastery so financially exhausted that the monks endured extremely poor food and struggled to purchase basic provisions. Academic research connects the repeated wool agreements and mounting debt with Pipewell's eventual bankruptcy. This is what medieval sheep estate failure can look like. The barn still exists. The land still exists. Some sheep may still be grazing, but several future harvests already belong to creditors. The owner no longer controls the cash produced by the flock. That is the third financial trap. Advanced sales solve liquidity problems by selling tomorrow's flexibility. Now compare that with a stronger wool estate. Buildwas Abbey offers a useful model. Its estates combined livestock with other agriculture. Known holdings included hundreds of sheep in Derbyshire and Herefordshire. By 1291, livestock accounted for a majority of the recorded income from important parts of its estate. The wool was connected to merchants trading with Flanders and Italy. That last point matters. The monastery did not need to transform every fleece into finished cloth itself. Its advantage was producing a valuable raw material efficiently and connecting that material to buyers who operated across Europe. Other Cistercian houses followed similar systems. They developed granges, specialized outlying farms that could organize grazing, livestock, labor, and production away from the central monastery. Some of these landscapes show how heavily monasteries invested in the wool economy. The strong version therefore combines production and distribution. Good pasture, enough meadow, healthy animals, experienced shepherds, organized granges, reliable storage, and merchant relationships capable of turning the annual clip into cash. The weak owner counts sheep. The strong owner measures wool per sheep. The weak owner expands the flock whenever wool prices rise. The strong owner asks whether winter feed can support those animals. The weak owner celebrates a large advance payment from a foreign merchant. The strong owner remembers that the payment belongs to wool that has not grown yet. The weak owner sees empty meadow and asks how many more sheep can fit. The strong owner asks what happens after 3 months of rain, a poor hay harvest, or an outbreak of disease. Same animal, different business. Now imagine you are acquiring a medieval sheep estate. You begin with the land. How much permanent pasture exists? How much meadow produces hay? Which grazing rights are legally secure? Which areas flood? Which areas dry out? How far must the sheep travel between seasonal pastures? Then you inspect the flock. How many are breeding ewes? How many are wethers? How many are lambs? How many animals are old? What has mortality looked like? Has disease appeared recently? Then comes the wool. How much did each sheep produce last year? How was the fleece graded? Which merchants bought it? How much was rejected or downgraded? Then comes winter feed. A large summer flock can hide a winter capacity problem. The question is not how many sheep can stand on the estate in June. It is how many can still be fed in February. Then you inspect the granges, barns, folds, fences, carts, horses, tools, and wool storage buildings. Then the accounts. Has next year's wool already been sold? What about the year after that? Which merchants have advanced cash? What penalties exist if delivery fails? How much debt is hidden behind the next shearing season? Finally, you study market access. How far is the nearest important wool market? How expensive is transport? Do merchants compete for the estate's clip, or does one buyer control access? An ordinary observer sees thousands of sheep. A sophisticated medieval owner sees grass converted into fiber through a 12-month biological supply chain. The business changed throughout the later Middle Ages. One major change was the growth of English cloth production. Exporting raw wool remained important, but over time more value could be captured by processing wool inside England and exporting finished cloth. That changed the relationship between growers, merchants, and textile producers. Another change was labor. The Black Death dramatically reduced population in the 14th century and changed rural labor markets. Land, wages, tenancy, and estate management evolved. A system designed around abundant labor could no longer assume the same economics. Disease remained another permanent risk. Modern investors worry about a factory shutting down. The medieval wool owner had a factory that could become sick, stop reproducing, or die. And unlike a machine, the productive asset also needed food every day. So could owning a medieval sheep estate make you rich? Absolutely. Wool created fortunes. It supported monasteries. It financed merchants. It connected English pasture with European cities. But the strong version was never simply the estate with the largest flock. It had the right land, enough winter fodder, healthy animals, good wool, experienced management, reliable merchants, and enough financial discipline to avoid spending next year's fleece before the sheep had produced it. The weak version saw high wool prices and added more animals. Then winter arrived. Disease arrived. Prices changed. The merchant arrived asking for wool that had already been paid for. From the road, both estates could look equally rich. Thousands of sheep cover the hills. The wool house is full after shearing. Carts wait beside the barn. But one estate owns a productive flock and the cash it will generate. The other is feeding animals whose future will already belongs to somebody else. The sheep are not the business. The pasture, flock health, and trading network that turn grass into wool are.